Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hope you're doing well. We are continuing our reading of Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra book. It is filled with really unique symbolism. The grammar is on point, has a potency to it that triggers the imagination, and so we're going to continue on that path. This title was called On Self-Overcoming. Let's begin. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Will to truth, you who are wisest, call that which impels you and fills you with lust. A will to the thinkability of all beings. A will to the thinkability of all beings. This I call your will. You want to make all being thinkable, for you doubt with well-founded suspicion that this is already thinkable, but it shall yield and bend for you. Thus your will wants, it shall become smooth and serve the spirit as its mirror and reflection. So, the well-founded, that's your will wants it. So smooth, serve your spirit as its mirror and reflection. Kind of sounds like the Tao Te Ching, in a way, or such a thing. Very Asian mysticism-like, with water kind of breaking down and making its way little by little, and then carving out the landscape how it wants. That is your whole will, you who are wisest. A will to power, when you speak of good and evil too, and of valutations, you still want to create the world before which you can kneel. That is your ultimate hope and intoxication. So, a will to power. We hear this a lot in Nietzsche's rhetoric. And then that we want to create a world that is so awe-inspiring that we kneel to it. That's our hope that keeps us going, and it's our intoxicant, our sort of numbing pain for when we can't have that in the immediate. So you see the shanty towns, poverty, famine, and we keep going and hoping that we'll create a world in which when we see it we're like awe-inspired, dumbfounded. Thing is, we might have such a thing, but as a society as a whole, when it comes to architecture, we will have a difficult time agreeing. Like, Times Square to me is absolutely repugnant. Other people like that kind of stuff. I see a forest and I'm like, that's awe-inspiring. Thing is, when you go into a city, there's no nature. You go out of the city, you're like, this is how it should be. More plants and trees. And then you see the middle ground where people have planted enough trees to where you can still have glimpses of nature and the water's clear. But as a Muslim, we know that paradise is going to be such a area where we'll be awe-inspired, to the point where we would want to kneel if we could. The unwise, of course, the people, they are like a river on which a bark drifts, and in the bark sit the valuations solemn and muffled up. Your will and your valutations you have placed on the river of becoming. So the river of becoming. It sounds very, when Aquinas mentions the potentialities of becoming and beingness and becoming, it sounds a lot like that. And what the people believe to be good and evil. That betrays me an ancient will to power. So we see a modern sense of good and evil, And then we see him hinting at an ancient will to power. Which one could say, oh, that's primitive, but I think this sort of raw engagement with Earth. It was you who are wisest who placed such guests in this bark and gave them pomp and proud names. You and your dominant will. Now the river carries your bark farther. It has to carry it. It avails nothing that the broken wave foams and angrily opposes the keel. Not the river is your danger and the end of your good and evil. You who are wisest, but that will itself, the will to power, the unexhausted procreative will of life. Okay, so we got it right here. Okay, will itself, the will to power, is the unexhausted procreative will of life. Okay, this is very important for us to annotate. Right there. Procreative. It's not a death. Right? It's not apocalyptic in that sense. Unexhausted. So it's this energetic battery that never runs out, that is always trying to survive and to keep going. It's not something that's like, I'll just spiral out and fade away. It's not this nihilistic death cult worship, right? So you're not lighting yourself on fire. No, you're overcoming. You have a will, and that will wants life, not death. It's procreative. It wants to keep existing, not fetishizing mutilation and death and decay. But to make you understand my word concerning good and evil, I shall now say to you my word concerning life and the nature of all the living. I pursued the living. I walked the widest and the narrowest paths, that I might know its nature. Now, this was very unique here. To pursue the living is different than pursuing death. Wanting to end things rather than wanting to experience the energetic, procreative will of life. Right? It's quite different the way in which you operate. Now, walking the widest, the narrowest. When you're on the widest path, it's like you have to watch for, like, think of the freeway. You're on the freeway. You're watching for all these different elements. It's a different way that your mind has to work, and you have to keep it moving. Even if you're on the bike path, you have to watch out for how people are moving. There's a lot of space. But with that comes more people going in and out, bobbing and weaving. And a narrow path, well, now, if you've ever gone hiking and then there's like a, not a very good trail, but it like goes at an angle, and it's like very soft terrain, gravel, you name it, or even snow, you can slide right down. You have to step, and you're really hyper focused on what's around the corner. And if you go and you see these trucks that are driving high up in the mountains on these little tiny roads, and then another truck comes, like, they have to like squeeze past each other. It's really precarious. And take that narrow path. It's also that example of walk along the razor's edge. So the narrow path is the razor's edge. One misstep and there you go. And when you're trying to squeeze in, there's a small opening. Go for it. Might not make it. If it's wide, you have to work on, oh, there's so much space. You have to work on still progressing even though it's so wide. When something's narrow, you have a very narrow window of something. Time is of the essence, right? It's more fleeting. And a wider path almost procrastinates you more. There's so many ways you could look at that, right? The niche versus the general, stuff like that. It's so many ways you could look at what he's saying. With 100-fold mirror, I still caught its glance when its mouth was closed, so that its eyes might speak to me, and its eyes spoke to me. But wherever I found the living, there I heard also the speech on obedience. Whatever lives obeys. Ooh, that's a line. I might turn that into a quote. Whatever lives obeys. You obey something, right? And this is the second point. He who cannot obey himself is commanded. Ooh, now we're talking. Look at that. Would you look at that? So, wow, I really just like this. This is, we are slaves of Allah. Slaves obey their master. We hear, we obey. We have these phrases in Islam. Okay? Men disciplining their desires. Women disciplining theirs. Our inner nafs, our inner self. Okay? We can't do that. We're led by the devil into lust of things. He's commanding us. We're trapped. Addiction. Drugs. They command you. Okay? You're not obeying the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to not use intoxicants. Now you're commanded by the spirits that you're taking. Spirits, when you go in the grocery store, baka, jinn, they call it spirits for a reason. Right? It's possessing you. Urging you. It has a will. Spirit. Will. Jinn. That is the nature of the living. This, however, is the third point that I heard. That commanding is harder than obeying. Ooh. Is it? Makes me think of when Eddard Stark, Game of Thrones, says, "He who passes the sentence to swing the sword." So you give the command to behead somebody, you should be the one to carry it out. So a command as such has way harder. And if you look at Stannis Baratheon, how he was, he kind of went loony, obviously, because of Melisandre. But he commanded his people to keep going, and he fought on the battle lines. It's interesting when someone commands something that they themselves would not do, and then you contrast that to someone who commands something that they would do. Then you begin to see that commanding is harder than obeying. But then you hear the other phrase of, "I was just obeying orders." Right? And for people to think about the consequences of just blindly obeying orders, and how leaders will be held accountable on Judgment Day for the commands in which they gave. There's so much nuance, but it's really great. And not only because he who commands must carry the burden of all who obey, and because this burden may easily crush him. Ooh, that's spot on. That's just, it's so true. And so, you look at someone who's a despot, right? The soldiers obey him. His soldiers carry out it. He sees it in mass what has happened, right? Think of when Pharaoh commanded soldiers to go and take out the babies of his slaves in Egypt, right? During the time of Moses. You see it on whole. That's a heavy burden for a leader to bear, and it can make them repent or make them worse. That burden, is it going to weigh on your conscience and make you better, or turn you into a more compacted evil being capable of even more? An experiment and hazard appeared to me to be in all commanding, and whenever the living commands, it hazards itself. Indeed, even when it commands itself, it may still pay for its commanding. Pay for its commanding. It must become the judge, the avenger, and the victim of its own law. Ooh, the judge, the avenger, the victim. 3 things to think about. How does this happen? I ask myself, what persuades the living to obey and command, and to practice obedience even when it commands? Hear then my word, you who are wisest, test in all seriousness whether I have crawled into the very heart of life and into the very roots of its heart. Where I found the living, there I found will to power. And even in the will of those who serve, I found the will to be master. Now this is a very... Okay, look at this one. So, where I found the living, there I found the will to power. And even in the will of those who serve, I found the will to be a master. So the will to be a master. When Sir Jorah's father, who was the leader, the commander of the Night's Watch, I'm blanking on his mind. He gets killed in a mutiny, and he tells Jon Snow, before Jon Snow eventually becomes the commander of the Night's Watch, do you want to lead one day, boy? Or something like that. And he's like, yes, Lord Commander. And he's like, then learn how to follow. Something like that. Basically showing you, you must learn how to follow before you can lead. So that then necessitates that if those who want to lead must follow, and those who follow need to have the desire to be a master one day, because that's how you get the apprentice relationship. You start out as the novice rookie, and then you excel, and you have this desire to be a master of your craft one day. So you're living, because remember, he talked about the will to power is the unexhausted procreative will of life. Okay? So, if you are a follower, you're being commanded, you want to be a master one day, you have that. And so, some people do scouting, right? Like, they go to the team, sit down and say, okay, the chef's gonna retire soon, so who do you think can step up to be the replacement? Because we want to hire first from inside the company before we go outside of the company. So who do you think's ready for that promotion? Who do you think has what it takes? And so they're gonna look at something where that person who was led, who was the follower, do they have what it takes to step into that master energy, right? Do they have that will of life to be able to bear the burden of commanding? When you're a manager, if you're a good manager, you're going to take all the nagging from the workers. You're going to have to take the burdens of your choices if you screw up and you ruin the company, right? Or your managerial style was so bad everybody quit, right? Or they're complaining about you and then you lose your job, right? You can be good a follower, not meant for command. So there's going to be people who are living, and in them they have this potentiality where they want to have that will to be the master, right? Because when you hear this, I found the living, remember there's also the walking dead, people who are corpses and shells of themselves. So they are more automatons, they're more drones. He's pointing at somebody who still has that spark, hasn't been drilled and dusted down. The weaker should serve the stronger. This is true. This is very true. Very true. Now, he's not just saying might makes right, as in you got a bunch of biceps, therefore you can run the bank. But it's like, who is stronger in their mind and their will to power? Who has that procreative will of life that's so strong that they can overcome and lead and be awe-inspiring. To that it is persuaded by its own will, which would be master over what is weaker still. This is the one pleasure it does not want to renounce, and the smaller yields to the greater, so that it may have pleasure and power over the smallest. Thus even the greatest still yields, and for the sake of power risks life. For the sake of power risk life. So should you be in power if you don't want to risk your life? If you only risk the life of others? Right? Because remember, he said commanding is harder than obeying. You're gonna pay for your commanding. So that means you will risk your life. Because the ultimate price is death. Which means you need to risk life in order to get what you've earned. You see, it's all connecting here. That is the yielding of the greatest. It is hazard and danger and casting dice for death. So here we see hazard, danger, casting dice for death. This is way more motivational than a moron lighting themselves on fire who's mentally ill and deranged, or committing self-harm, or flagellation, I think is the word, where you're like whipping yourself in public, like, I hate myself. There were some fanatical cults in the past who used to do that. And there's also other religions where they just sit in the street and they smoke weed and they don't do anything besides follow cows around and lay on things that hurt. And, you know, they're not risking anything. They're just kind of really weird in their own bizarreness. But you see here, Nietzsche's letting us know about the superior man, where he's going to risk hazard and danger. So if you're a soldier, you want to move up to a higher note, right? You know there's going to come more risk. That's the way it should be. The king should have immense amounts of risk. It's not like today where a feeble, dementia-ridden, ice cream eating Joe Biden can just point his finger and just all the brave men are like drained from the country, and we got a bunch of single moms and widows and orphans, and yeah, just he has no real risk of death. Coups are not a thing in America, right? Yeah, he has the what do you call that, Secret Service, but we're just not that kind of a country. He doesn't come down and be in the heat of the moment like the male commanders and leaders of old. Notice when people started separating themselves from the common soldier, they became more luxurious, more pompous, more decadent, right? There's a ruggedness that you got from like Caesar, Mark Antony, and just plain leaders who were friends with the military, because the military is one of the highest costs, because it has the most danger and the most hazard, right? And you don't know what's going to happen when you go out there. So it's really, really unique when you examine all the different things he's talking about. The weaker should serve the stronger. The weak leader shouldn't be in the position of authority, right? It should be the most mentally strong, best quality human in the United States should be the president. It should not be career politicians who are decrepit, mentally unstable, and feeble. If you want to have an old wise guy, he's got to be like super wise, like a philosopher king, right? I'm not sure how it would be with Amir al-Mu'minin, the commander of the faithful, like the caliph of the Muslims. How it would be then, but you'd want the best for the job, right? So Nietzsche is pointing out a lot of things here that we can look at in our own culture, in our own companies, in family, right? This is why, men are more fit to lead. And where men make sacrifices and serve and cast amorous glances, there too is the will to be master. So the will to be master. Along stealthy paths the weaker steals into the castle, and into the very heart of the more powerful, and there steals power. In life itself confided this secret to me. Behold, it said, I am that which must always overcome itself. Indeed, you call it a will to procreative, or a drive to an end, to something higher, farther, more manifold. But all this is one and one secret. Rather would I perish than forswear this. And verily, where there is perishing and falling of leaves, behold, there life sacrifices itself for power. That I must be struggle, and a becoming, and an end, and an opposition to ends. Alas, whoever guesses what is my will should also guess on what crooked paths it must proceed. Whatever I create, and however much I love it, soon I must oppose it, and my love. Thus my will wills it, and you too, lover of knowledge, are only a path and a footprint of my will. Verily my will to power walks also on the hills of your will to truth. On the hills. Indeed, the truth was not hit by him who shot at it with the word of the will to existence. That will does not exist, for what does not exist cannot will. What does not exist cannot will. That's a line right there. But what is existence? How could that still want existence? Only where there is life is there also will. Not will to life, but thus I teach you, will to power. So we have will to life, will to power. There's much that life esteems more highly than life itself, but out of the esteeming itself speaks the will to power. Thus life once taught me, and with this I shall yet solve the riddle of your heart, you who are wisest. Verily I say unto you, good and evil that are not transitory do not exist. Driven on by themselves, they must overcome themselves again and again. With your values and words of good and evil, you do violence when you value. You do violence. Words are violence. Are you becoming woke on us, Nietzsche? We do violence when we value. That is a very wise line right there, because evil you do violence when you value. Depends on whose spectrum, right? Because if we say, I value the life of the mother over the child, then the child dies, we see that as evil. We say we value the life of the baby and before the life of the mother, then they say that that's evil. So sometimes evil can be on both sides depending on whose shoes you're in. Some things are more clear cut, but our values, when we carry them out, someone might perceive it as evil. And what we do to preserve those values, it's really quite interesting. And that is your hidden love, and the splendor and trembling and overflowing of your soul. But a more violent force and a new overcoming grow out of your values and break egg and eggshell. And whoever must be a creator in good and evil, verily, he must first be an annihilator and break values. Would you look at that? That's a testy line right there. If you want to create good and evil, you must first be an annihilator and break values. This is why pacificity is not real. Because you're going to have opposite values, right? And that person who's going to create their version of good is going to have to break your values and annihilate what they think is evil that you do. So you can't just be like, we all have to, brush each other's hair and permit and tolerate everything. You can see here Nietzsche kind of points it out that you can't be that. You can't just be like this floating jellyfish. Even the jellyfish has a stinger. You have to know how to annihilate and how to break. And then after you do that, you can create. Not as in create things like, if you want to make change, you want to reform. That's creating reform. Creating something better. Creating a harder path for evil to flow. You must break the dam. You must break their foothold in the land, right? Thus the highest evil belongs to the highest goodness. But this is creative. Let us speak of this, you who are wisest. Even if it be bad, silence is worse. All truths that are kept silent become poisonous. And may everything be broken that cannot brook our truths. There are yet many houses to be built. Thus spoke Zarathustra. I like that one. Lots of symbolism in here. To recall, he who cannot obey himself is commanded, walking the widest and narrow path to know its nature. But that will itself, the will to power, the unexhausted procreative will of life, the will to be master, a will to procreate or a drive to an end, to something higher, farther, more manifold, lover of knowledge, being on the heels of your will to truth. He found the living, and there he found the will to power, even in those who serve. They had the will to be a master, that the weak should serve the stronger. For the sake of power risks life, that is a yielding of the greatest. It is hazard and danger in casting dice for death. It's really a great section. I think one of the best in the book thus far. I really like that one. Now, you remember in past readings, he had a whimsical part. There was some humor in there. Really good book, I must say. For every philosophy lover and person who kind of wants to have something to stimulate your brain, I really do think that this is a book that does that. Very enjoyable. I hope you learned something. I know I did. And if you'd like to join the blog and support the two channels, that would be available for you to do on the blog, which is www.subscribestar.com/MilahanArchive. Still fundraising for the book holder and wooden panel, and there's a tip function on the blog that allows you to do that. Thanks for everyone for tuning in, and take care.